You're watching Press of World News. Time now for the news review. NATO's 30 members signed an accession protocol for Finland and Sweden, taking a further step toward letting the two Nordic states into the military alliance. Under the protocol, both countries can take part in the alliance's meetings and have more access to intelligence. But NATO will not defend them militarily until their membership is ratified. Speaking to the presser, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg hailed the signing of the protocol as a historic moment. A moment, that is. He said that the alliance will be stronger and safer with its new members.
This is an historic day for Finland, for Sweden, for NATO, and for Euro-Atlantic security. I commend all allies for moving so quickly in accepting Finland and Sweden's applications for membership. And I want to thank Turkey, Finland and Sweden for their constructive approach.
Now, the signing of the protocol follows a deal with Turkey at last week's summit in Madrid. After weeks of talks, Ankara lifted its veto on the Nordic countries' membership bids after assurances that both would do more to fight terrorism. Sweden and Finland had requested to join NATO after Russia launched its military operation in Ukraine in February. Russia has repeatedly expressed opposition to NATO's enlargement. Last week, President Vladimir Putin said it's inevitable that Moscow's relations with Helsinki and Stockholm will sour once they join the U.S.-led alliance. Now, let me invite two guests to see what they think about this and share their views with us. So, Dan DeBar, activist and commentator, joining me from Westchester, New York. And also, we have Frank Emspeck, radio producer and political commentator in Madison. Good to see you, gentlemen. Now, Don, Mr. Stoltenberg saying that Finland and Sweden joining NATO, it makes NATO stronger. Is that serious? I mean, will that prove to be a game changer or anything?
Well, you have to try to parse what he means by that. Are you adding to the industrial capacity to sustain a long-term war? Are you adding to logistical support, to support, for example, fuel deliveries to invading tanks, etc.? Are you adding air bases or, listening outposts or whatever? There's some minor technical, utility there for the real war that is likely to evolve out of what's happening right now. That will not be a traditional 20th or 19th or 18th century war with battlefields and all of that, but with aerial devices, electronic warfare, maybe nuclear weapons. And in that case, Finland and Sweden are useless really to NATO, except as real estate to absorb some of the first blows of some of the real war that's coming. And President Putin more or less pointed this out, saying, on the one hand, you guys are free to join any alliance you like. We really don't care. If you're going to be positioning materials that are going to be used in an offensive war against us, they're going to be our first legitimate targets. And that means where before we had no reason to blow up your stuff, we will be blowing up your stuff. Mm-hmm. And so it changes the dynamic in that sense. The larger picture is that you have a war in Ukraine right now, but Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So supposedly the U.S. and NATO are not at war with Russia. The U.S., however, is training, the Ukrainian troops, and some are, say, commanding them now, in some cases, providing weaponry that, as of the last few days, has allowed Ukraine, as proxy, to use American-supplied weapons with American training to bomb Russian cities. Right. However, Russia's response to that does not necessitate an Article 5 NATO all-out war with Russia. That situation will be different if these two ascend, and they're not ascending yet, but they're in the process of ascension, into full NATO membership. And so what the only real value that this has is to those who want to have an actual war with Russia and would like the first blows to not land on Berlin, London, Madrid, Paris, etc., but rather land on those two countries, Finland and Sweden.
Okay. Now, Frank, how do you look at this story? I mean, will this accession bring further security or insecurity in the region?
I think clearly when you have two countries that were neutral, even though they were clearly had some relations with NATO. And now you bring them into an alliance that is particularly aggressive. Obviously, those two countries are more insecure. And within those countries, to an extent, in both social democratic parties, you've had expressed opposition. They don't have enough strength to prevent it, as far as I can see. But from the Russians' point of view, they said they wanted to invade or neutralize Ukraine, so they're not part of NATO. So clearly, that kind of political decision in regards to NATO is a complete disaster, because what it did is it allowed the right wing in Sweden and Finland to go on the offensive and say they wanted to be part of NATO. Now, Jules Stoltenberg there from Norway, the Secretary General, Jens, has always been an aggressive force in NATO. For the last 10 years, he's wanted expansion. He's been very pointed in his attacks on people and so on and so forth. So that's not new from him. But what is new here is that Sweden has compromised its sovereignty, because the deal with Turkey means that Sweden is going to have to go after the Kurds and limit some of their amnesty and essentially take sides in the civil war in Turkey against the minority Kurds. And so I think on a lot of different fronts, it's a negative thing, including fighting for democracy. I think it increases instability, and it certainly sets up a situation where, from the Russians' point of view, they now have somebody on their border, about 800 miles of it, that is hostile. And before, everybody could say, well, the Finns are neutral and not going to do anything. Now, it's not necessarily the case.
Okay. Now, gentlemen, let's check out some of the comments that people have posted on social media, and then we'll get back to you with more questions. Now, the first post goes, I still don't understand what Sweden and Finland get out of the whole NATO thing, except being put on the World War III nuke map. Does it come with free weapons or military industrial investments or something? What am I missing? Mary Ellen Carter says one of Putin's main goals in invading Ukraine was to stop any eastern expansion of NATO, but he has achieved the opposite by pushing Sweden and Finland to joining. Now NATO is on his border for 800 miles. Be careful what you wish for, Mr. President. The third post goes, NATO's never-ending expansion drift caused this war, and its fateful march eastward is now paying off with 2 new signups. Sweden and Finland are making a huge mistake. And another one says that the US and NATO have planned this war for decades. Look at NATO expansion and how it concentrates around Russia. There is no expansion in the southern hemisphere. Sweden and Finland to join soon. Can you see Russia's security concerns? NATO is in Ukraine as we speak. Okay, gentlemen, let me pick up on that last post, and I want to ask Don what he thinks about this. That they're saying that the U.S. and NATO, they have planned this war already. There was a plan for this, and they meant it. Do you agree with that? They did want this to happen.
Well, of course. Look, the most expensive and longest running project in human history, running since at least 1917 for the United States, earlier for Britain, Germany, and others, has been to capture Russia and steal its resources and essentially enslave its population or kill it. Hitler would have preferred to just kill it. The U.S. military budgets that have been, over $500 billion for decades and decades now, and that in the aggregate are tens, if not $100 trillion, going back, 105 years or whatever, had as a primary goal that. And so, that this war is conducted, and the political environment in Finland and Sweden are manipulated into this is not an accident, certainly. That there have probably been several desks at Langley working on this eventuality for years. The important thing to note is that, and this goes to the first comment, where they asked, what's in it for Sweden and Finland.
Right.
That's the wrong question. The decisions aren't made by Finland or Sweden. The decisions are made by the elites in those countries, okay? And when the United States goes there, it doesn't poll the population except to try to figure out how to force them to settle for what's about to be imposed upon them by their elite. And they buy the elite if they don't intimidate them, or they remove them and replace them, as we saw in Ukraine, like they've been trying to do in Venezuela, like they did in Iran in 1953, like they did in Guatemala in 1954, and on and on and on. So that's the condition that we're looking at. And we're looking at, if you're talking about the encirclement and an additional 800-mile border like the other person did, looking at a map, what was in the press just today about delivering stealth fighter planes to South Korea, quote unquote. You have a situation where the Sakhalin Islands, which have been a point of dispute between Japan and Russia since at least the 1905 war, are now a focal point again, and the cutting off, or certainly the sharp increase in negotiation and haggling with Japan over supplying oil to it, is almost as acute as it was before it attacked the United States in 1941. We have that situation on that side, the hot war is being conducted here, the positioning of various parties, including, by the way, the pending ascension of Georgia into NATO, all while an extreme economic condition is about to descend, in the process of descending on Europe, that can produce God knows what kind of outcomes. Revolutions and everything are quite possible there. And a maniac in the White House, or an imbecile in the White House, with people pushing a policy of aggressive war on Russia's border. It's a very toxic mixture.
Okay, Frank, does the U.S. and EU really care about a loss of life on both sides, be it Ukrainian or Russian, or do they have another agenda?
I think the Ukrainian agenda is to survive, but I think it's important that as this began to heat up, Zelensky wanted to negotiate something with the Russians. And after some initiatives in that direction, a complete reversal occurred. And you wonder whether that's because of our pressure, or because of internal pressure from the Azov battalion, or because, as Noam Chomsky and others have alleged, that they basically said they'd shoot him if he decided to work out some deal with the Russians. So there's that. There's also our willingness to fight to the last Ukrainian, which may come about sooner than anybody had thought. So there's all that going on, but I think overall, it's an extraordinarily unstable and dangerous situation because of the political situation here. The major thing that Biden has going for him, and this has been true with Democratic administrations in the past, with Korea to an extent, although it didn't work out ultimately. Eisenhower had a plan for peace, and that's why he won. Nixon had a plan for peace too, a secret plan, and that's how he beat Humphrey. But the Democrats have always tried to use these wars as a basis for rallying behind the president. And I think that these could get out of hand. When you're talking about Russia, you're not talking about somebody with no air force, no industry, and no troops. So these, it doesn't add up. Very dangerous. Then you have, I think, a situation that's uncontrollable in what was Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, and whatnot. Yes, they certainly take direction from the United States, but they're independent countries also, with an axe to grind vis-a-vis Russia. And, there are just so many points of instability here, and so many people have advanced weapons, that it is an extraordinarily dangerous situation. And then we can throw in what we're doing in the Middle East, what the United States is doing there, trying to put together a coalition against Iran, meeting with Saudi Arabia, meeting with Israel, and forgetting about the dismemberment of Khashoggi. And so in each area, we are seeing a movement away from anything positive, democracy, freedom of speech, the climate, and towards militarism and authoritarianism, including here.
All right. Thank you so much, Don DeBar in Westchester. I'm Frank Emspak in Madison. And thank you for watching this episode of the News Review.